Between 1851 and 1854, 17 plantation owners across central Alabama died in their beds under identical circumstances. Crushed windpipes, no signs of struggle, bedroom doors locked from the inside. Every victim had recently purchased the same type of enslaved worker. Young albino males sold for almost nothing. Some paid 3 cents, others a few dollars. The purchases were recorded in ledgers as minimal value property. What those ledgers never documented was why these men commanded so little, or why they vanished without trace after each master's death. Before we continue with the story of the slave they called Jacob White and the calculated terror he brought to Alabama's cotton empire, hit that subscribe button right now. These aren't bedtime stories. These are buried truths erased from history for over 170 years. Drop your state or city in the comments. Let's see how far this forgotten horror reaches. In March of 1851, the Wetumpka slave market in central Alabama witnessed something that veteran traders would later describe as unprecedented. A young man, no more than 17 years of age, was brought to auction in chains so heavy they seemed designed for a man twice his size. His skin held no pigment whatsoever, pale as raw cotton, hair white as winter frost, eyes the color of water reflecting a colorless sky. The auctioneer opened bidding at $50, a reasonable sum for a field hand of working age. Within minutes, the price had plummeted to 3 cents, and even then, only one buyer showed interest. The Wetumpka market operated every Saturday from March through November, positioned on a raised wooden platform that overlooked the Coosa River. Traders brought enslaved people from across the region, displaying them like livestock, examining teeth and muscles, documenting scars that might indicate a tendency toward resistance. The platform had seen thousands of transactions over 2 decades of operation, each one reducing human beings to columns of figures in leather-bound ledgers. But on this particular morning, the usual rhythm of commerce collapsed into something closer to collective revulsion. When Jacob was led onto the platform, the crowd's reaction was immediate and visceral. Women turned away, shielding their eyes as if from something obscene. Men whispered to one another, making signs against evil that they would have mocked as superstition in any other context. The auctioneer, a man named Silas Crawford who prided himself on his ability to sell anything to anyone, found his practiced patter dying in his throat. He had sold children away from mothers, had separated husbands from wives, had conducted transactions that destroyed families with the casual efficiency of a man tallying grain. But standing before this pale young man whose appearance defied every category his world recognized, Crawford felt something he could not name. A vertigo born from looking at someone who should not exist according to the logic that governed his entire profession. The bidding, such as it was, became an exercise in failure. $50 drew no interest. 40 produced only uncomfortable silence. 30, 20, 10. The price descended like a stone dropping through dark water. At $5, Crawford paused, scanning the crowd with growing desperation. At $1, he began to understand that no amount of reduction would make this particular piece of property attractive to buyers who operated according to principles that required clear visual distinctions between owner and owned. How could a man display as property someone whose skin appeared whiter than his own? How could he parade before visitors someone who created cognitive dissonance simply by existing? The final bid came from Thomas Riverside, a planter whose reputation for calculated cruelty was matched only by his talent for finding profit in what others dismissed as worthless. 3 cents. The amount was less than the cost of the paper on which the transaction would be recorded. Crawford accepted with visible relief, grateful to complete a sale that had become increasingly uncomfortable with each passing moment. The crowd dispersed quickly, as if proximity to Jacob carried some contagion they feared might prove transmissible. What none of them understood, what they could not have anticipated, was that they had just witnessed the purchase of something far more dangerous than any of them imagined. They saw worthlessness where there was calculation. They saw weakness where there was patience. They saw an aberration to be exploited when they should have seen a reckoning that had learned to walk upright, purchased for less than the cost of a loaf of bread, and already counting debts that would be paid in blood. The condition that marked Jacob White for a life of particular cruelty was not understood by medical science in 1851, though doctors had documented its existence for centuries. Albinism, the absence of melanin in skin, hair, and eyes, occurred across all human populations with equal rarity. But in the antebellum South, where the entire apparatus of slavery rested on the visible difference between white and black, an enslaved person born without color became a walking contradiction that threatened the foundations of racial logic. The ideology of racial slavery required absolute categories. It demanded that difference be visible, permanent, and unmistakable. Skin color served as the primary marker of this distinction, the superficial characteristic upon which an entire economic and social system was constructed. White signified freedom, power, and humanity. Black signified enslavement, submission, and property. The system could accommodate no ambiguity, no middle ground, no evidence that these categories were arbitrary constructions rather than natural facts. Jacob's existence represented precisely the kind of ambiguity the system could not tolerate. He possessed African ancestry. His mother was enslaved, as were her parents before her. Yet his appearance contradicted every visual assumption about race that sustained the plantation economy. When white planters looked at him, they saw a reflection of themselves in the body of someone they claimed to own. The mirror was intolerable. It suggested that the difference between master and slave might be nothing more than circumstance, that the characteristics they believed marked inherent superiority and inferiority were superficial rather than essential. Medical texts of the period described albinism in language that revealed the anxieties it provoked. Dr. Samuel Cartwright, the Louisiana physician who invented diseases to explain slave resistance, wrote in 1851 that albinism in Negroes represented a corruption of natural order, evidence of degeneration that rendered such individuals unfit for proper labor. Other doctors proposed that albinism resulted from moral failings in previous generations, punishment visited upon descendants for sins of their ancestors. The explanations varied, but they shared a common purpose: to contain the threat Jacob's appearance posed to racial logic by reframing it as pathology, disease, or divine judgment. But Jacob carried no disease except the one that infected the people who claimed to own him. His vision was poor in bright sunlight, a common characteristic of albinism. His skin burned easily under the brutal Alabama sun. Beyond these physical realities, he was simply a young man born into circumstances not of his choosing, carrying in his body evidence that the categories used to justify his enslavement were fictions maintained through violence rather than truths written in biology. The planters who purchased him at reduced prices understood none of this. They saw only a problem to be managed, an anomaly that disrupted the visual grammar of their world. They could not display him alongside other enslaved workers without inviting questions they did not wish to answer. They could not sell him for profit when his appearance made buyers uncomfortable. They could not even effectively exploit his labor because his pale skin made fieldwork a torture that reduced productivity rather than enhancing it. So they relegated him to isolation, worked him in conditions designed more to punish than to profit, and transferred him between properties like a burden no one wished to carry, but no one knew how to dispose of. Each transaction was recorded with diminishing prices, 3 cents, $2, 50 cents. A descending scale of value that measured not Jacob's worth but rather the depth of discomfort his existence provoked. They thought they were purchasing nearly worthless property. They were actually purchasing the instrument of their own destruction, buying on credit a debt that would soon come due. Jacob White was born on the Thornton plantation in 1834, the son of a woman named Sarah, who worked in the cotton fields from sunrise until long after dark. His appearance at birth caused immediate disruption. The plantation mistress, Eleanor Thornton, insisted he must be the product of relations with a white man, though Sarah had never left the quarters except to work. The master, William Thornton, saw in the infant something that unsettled him deeply, a mirror that reflected his own face in the body of someone he claimed to own. The first 8 years of Jacob's life were defined by systematic isolation. While other enslaved children played together in the brief hours between work and sleep, Jacob was confined to a small cabin at the edge of the quarters, separated by 50 yards of empty ground that might as well have been an ocean. His mother was permitted to visit only after dark, when his pale form would not be visible to anyone who might be watching. She brought him food, taught him to speak in whispers, and told him stories about a world beyond the plantation boundaries, though she herself had never seen it. William Thornton visited the cabin regularly, though never for reasons that suggested paternal care. He studied Jacob with the detached fascination of a naturalist examining an exotic specimen. He measured the boy's growth, documented the texture of his hair, examined his eyes in lamplight to understand why they appeared colorless in certain illumination. The examinations were clinical, cold, and increasingly violent as Jacob aged and began to resist being handled like livestock. Thornton seemed to believe that sufficient observation might reveal some explanation for the boy's appearance that would resolve the dissonance it created. The explanation never emerged, and Thornton's frustration manifested in beatings that left marks no one, except Sarah, ever saw. Jacob's education came not from books or formal instruction, but from the architecture of his own suffering. He learned that his appearance provoked reactions he could neither predict nor control. Some people recoiled from him with visible disgust. Others stared with morbid curiosity. A few responded with violence born from fear they could not articulate. He learned to read faces, to anticipate reactions before they occurred, to make himself small and quiet and forgettable in situations where visibility carried danger. By the age of 8, when William Thornton died and the estate was liquidated, Jacob had developed a capacity for stillness that was both survival mechanism and weapon. He could stand motionless for hours, breathing so shallowly that even people standing nearby forgot he was present. He could move through spaces with a silence that seemed impossible for someone of physical substance. He had learned the most important lesson his circumstances could teach, that in a world where his appearance made him visible in all the wrong ways, invisibility was a skill that required constant practice and ruthless discipline. The auction that followed Thornton's death was Jacob's first experience of the market that would trade him like damaged goods for the next 9 years. He stood on the platform in Wetumpka, chains heavy on his wrists, and watched grown men recoil from the sight of him. He heard the auctioneer's voice rise and fall, heard the bidding stall and collapse, heard himself described as defective, unnatural, barely worth the cost of transport. And standing there in chains, being sold for the first time to a buyer who saw him as nothing more than a curiosity purchased at discount, Jacob felt something crystallize inside him. It was not rage, exactly, though rage was certainly part of it. It was clarity, an understanding that the system which claimed to own him had made a fatal error. It had created someone who had nothing left to lose, and it had taught him exactly how to make himself invisible. 600 words. When William Thornton died in 1842, his estate was liquidated to settle debts accumulated through decades of mismanagement and failed speculation. Jacob, then 8 years old, was brought to auction for the first time. The experience would be repeated 7 times over the next 9 years, as owner after owner purchased him cheaply. discovered they could neither display him nor profit from him, and eventually sold him at a loss. The ledgers that documented these transactions read like a descending scale of human value. 3 cents to the Whitfield plantation in 1842, $2 to the Morrison property in 1844, 50 cents to a merchant in Montgomery in 1846 who planned to use him in a traveling exhibition, but lost his nerve before the first show. 75 cents to the Henderson plantation in 1847, $1.20 to the Garrison estate in 1848. Each price reflected not Jacob's utility but rather the degree of discomfort his presence provoked, the social cost of displaying property that challenged every visual assumption about race and slavery. The buyers who acquired him fell into predictable patterns. Some purchased him as novelty, imagining they could display him to visitors as evidence of natural diversity, proof that even within inferior races variations existed that defied expectation. These owners quickly discovered that displaying Jacob raised more questions than it answered. Visitors would ask whether he was actually enslaved, whether someone so pale could legitimately be claimed as property, whether the laws governing slavery applied to people whose appearance contradicted the racial categories those laws presumed. The questions were uncomfortable, occasionally dangerous, and inevitably led to Jacob being removed from visibility and relegated to isolated labor. Other buyers saw him as opportunity for profit through exploitation of curiosity. The Montgomery merchant who purchased him in 1846 planned a traveling show that would tour through Alabama and Mississippi, displaying the albino slave alongside other human oddities collected from auction blocks across the South. The merchant constructed a cage, printed handbills advertising nature's mistakes, human curiosities of the slave states, and prepared a script that described Jacob as evidence of divine punishment visited upon those who violated natural law. But on the night before the show's debut, the merchant found Jacob sitting calmly in his unlocked cage, having picked the lock with a nail he had straightened with his teeth. The merchant sold him the next morning for a loss and abandoned the traveling show entirely. A third category of buyer purchased Jacob purely for the economic calculation. His price was so low that even minimal labor would generate profit over time. These were the owners who worked him in isolation, who assigned him to tasks that could be performed away from other enslaved workers, who treated him as burden to be extracted rather than investment to be cultivated. They put him in fields during the hours when the sun would burn his skin until it blistered. They gave him the heaviest loads to carry, the most difficult jobs to complete. They beat him more frequently and more severely than others, as if violence could somehow resolve the dissonance his appearance created. With each sale, Jacob learned something valuable. He learned that his appearance made people uncomfortable in ways they could not articulate. He learned that discomfort could be weaponized. He learned that in a world where his body was both commodity and contradiction, invisibility was a form of power. Most importantly, he learned that the system, which claimed to own him, had reduced him to almost nothing. And in that reduction, it had freed him from every constraint except his own imagination. A person worth 3 cents has nothing left to lose. A person worth 3 cents can afford to think thoughts that would terrify those who believe they own him. Between 1842 and 1850, Jacob passed through the possession of 9 different owners across central Alabama. Each plantation operated with its own particular cruelties, but several provided him with skills that would later prove essential. The education was unintentional, delivered by people who never imagined they were training the instrument of their own destruction. But Jacob was an attentive student, and he understood that survival required learning everything his circumstances could teach. At the Garrison property, where he spent 18 months between 1848 and 1849, he was assigned to work as a blacksmith's assistant. The plantation blacksmith, a man named Moses who had purchased his own freedom years earlier, but remained on the property through complex arrangement with the owner, taught Jacob to work metal. He learned to read the color of heated iron, to understand the properties of heat and pressure, to shape tools designed for both construction and destruction. Moses showed him how force applied at precisely the right angle could bend metal that seemed inflexible, how sustained pressure could weaken materials that appeared unbreakable. The lessons were ostensibly about blacksmithing, but Jacob understood they applied equally to other forms of resistance. At the Caldwell estate in 1847, he was assigned to the main house, working as a servant in spaces usually reserved for enslaved people, whose appearance met the aesthetic standards white families required for those who served them. The assignment was unusual. His pale appearance made him unsettling to guests, but the Caldwell family found his otherness useful in its own way, a conversation piece that demonstrated their tolerance and sophistication. Jacob observed the rhythms of plantation life from the inside. He learned when masters slept, when doors were locked, when the household settled into its nightly vulnerability. He mapped the architecture of the main house in his memory. Which floorboards creaked, which doors squeaked, which windows could be opened silently, which rooms offered multiple exits. At the Henderson plantation in 1845, he encountered an overseer named Thomas Gray, who taught enslaved workers rudimentary reading, not from kindness, but from practicality. Gray believed that workers who could read written instructions were more efficient than those who required verbal explanation for every task. The lessons were basic, alphabet, simple words, numbers, but Jacob absorbed them with desperate intensity. He practiced writing in dirt, tracing letters with sticks when no one was watching. He memorized words from the few printed materials he could access: newspapers used to wrap goods, labels on supply crates, the occasional page from a discarded book. Literacy was forbidden to enslaved people in Alabama, but Gray's practical instruction gave Jacob access to a tool that would later prove invaluable. The most important education, however, came not from any specific skill, but from the cumulative experience of being traded like damaged merchandise across plantation after plantation. Jacob learned that the system which claimed to own him operated according to assumptions that could be exploited. White people saw what they expected to see. They noticed those who fit their preconceptions and overlooked those who disrupted their categorical thinking. His pale appearance made him hypervisible in some contexts and functionally invisible in others. In dim light, at certain angles, moving with deliberate slowness, he could pass through spaces without registering in the peripheral vision of people trained to look for bodies that fit specific visual profiles. By 1850, when he was 16 years old and had been sold 6 times to 6 different owners, Jacob had accumulated an education in violence, architecture, stealth, and the psychology of people who believed themselves masters of those they enslaved. He had learned to read, to work metal, to move silently, to pick locks, to understand the vulnerabilities of households that believed locked doors represented security. He had become something the system never anticipated, a person reduced to almost nothing, who had learned precisely how to reduce others to exactly nothing. It's 500 words. In January of 1851, Jacob was purchased by Thomas Riverside for 3 cents at a Wetumpka auction where no other bidders showed interest. Riverside ran a medium-sized cotton plantation with approximately 40 enslaved workers, and he saw in Jacob an opportunity to demonstrate his own tolerance, his enlightened approach to property management. He announced to visitors that he had purchased an albino slave purely as an act of Christian charity, that he would prove such individuals could be made productive despite their unfortunate condition. What Riverside did not anticipate was that charity founded on condescension is indistinguishable from cruelty in its effects. He worked Jacob in the fields during the hottest hours, when the sun burned his pigmentless skin until it blistered and bled. He displayed him to visitors as evidence of his own benevolence, forcing Jacob to stand silently while planters and their wives examined him like a curiosity in a traveling exhibition. He assigned him to sleep not in the quarters with the other workers, but in a storage shed near the main house, isolated and alone, where his pale appearance would not disturb the others. The shed was approximately 8 feet square, with a single small window that had been boarded shut years earlier. A thin blanket served as bedding against the dirt floor. Riverside provided minimal food, cornmeal and water, occasionally supplemented with scraps from the main house kitchen that were on the verge of spoiling. The isolation was deliberate, designed to break whatever spirit remained in someone who had already been broken by a decade of being traded like defective merchandise. But isolation gave Jacob something Riverside never intended: proximity to the main house and freedom from observation. While the other enslaved workers slept in the quarters under the watchful eye of an overseer, Jacob spent his nights in darkness, listening to the sounds of the plantation settling into sleep. He learned the rhythm of Riverside's habits. The master retired at 10 o'clock with mechanical regularity. He locked his bedroom door from the inside, a heavy bolt that scraped against metal brackets. He slept alone. His wife had died years earlier, and he had never remarried. Jacob spent 6 weeks observing, listening, mapping in his mind the architecture of vulnerability. The shed where he slept was positioned 20 feet from the main house. A large oak tree grew between them, its branches extending toward both structures. The house had been painted white in 1848, but the paint had begun to peel, leaving patches of bare wood that absorbed rather than reflected moonlight. The bedroom window, positioned on the second floor, remained open during winter nights despite the cold, because Riverside believed fresh air prevented illness. On the night of March 14th, Jacob lay on his blanket in the shed, watching through gaps in the boards as the lights in the main house were extinguished one by one. The last light to go dark was Riverside's bedroom. Jacob waited 2 hours until he was certain the household had settled into deep sleep. Then he stood, opened the shed door that had never been locked, and began walking toward the house with movements so slow and deliberate they appeared almost motionless in the darkness. 500 words. On March 15, 1851, Thomas Riverside retired to his bedroom at approximately 10 o'clock, as was his custom. His wife had traveled to Mobile to visit family, and he was alone in the main house except for the cook who slept in the kitchen outbuilding. The next morning, when he failed to appear for breakfast, his overseer entered the bedroom and discovered Riverside's body in bed, eyes open, face locked in an expression that suggested he had died while trying to scream. The county doctor who examined the corpse noted a crushed windpipe consistent with manual strangulation, but no defensive wounds, no signs of struggle, no indication that Riverside had fought his attacker. Most disturbing was the detail the doctor mentioned only in his private notes. The bedroom door had been locked from the inside, and the room's single window was sealed shut, painted closed years earlier, and never reopened. The overseer who discovered the body, a man named William Peters, later testified that the scene appeared undisturbed. Riverside lay in bed as if he had died peacefully in his sleep, except for the grotesque angle of his neck and the purple bruising around his throat. The bedclothes were neat. No furniture had been moved. The locked door showed no signs of forced entry, the bolt still secured in its brackets. The room contained no place for concealment, no wardrobe large enough to hide a person, no space beneath the bed, no curtains behind which someone could stand undetected. Peters immediately searched the property for Jacob, who was the obvious suspect given his proximity to the house and his history of being considered dangerous by previous owners. But the shed where Jacob had been housed stood empty, the door hanging open, the thin blanket he had used for bedding, left folded with unnatural precision on the dirt floor. A search of the quarters revealed that none of the other enslaved workers had seen Jacob since the previous evening. He had simply vanished, leaving behind only a single piece of evidence that Peters discovered, but chose not to report to the authorities. On the floor beside Riverside's bed, barely visible against the dark wood, was a handprint pressed in ash. The print was pale, the fingers long and delicate, positioned as if the person who left it had knelt beside the bed while Riverside slept. Peters stared at the print for a long moment, understanding in some inarticulate way that he was looking at evidence of something his world had no framework to accommodate. Then he wiped it away with his boot, eliminating the trace before calling for the doctor. The investigation that followed was perfunctory. The sheriff, more concerned with maintaining the appearance of order than with actual justice, concluded that Riverside had suffered a catastrophic failure of the heart. The locked room was not mentioned in the official report. The missing albino slave was noted but not pursued with any vigor. Within 3 days, the case was closed, and the property was prepared for sale to Riverside's distant relatives. No one spoke about the impossibility of what had occurred. Some truths are too dangerous to acknowledge. The investigation that found nothing. 500 words. The killing of Thomas Riverside should have triggered immediate and thorough investigation, but it occurred during a period when local law enforcement was more concerned with maintaining the appearance of order than with actual justice. The sheriff, a man named Porter Williams who owed his position to relationships with the planter class, concluded that Riverside had suffered a catastrophic failure of the heart that somehow mimicked strangulation. He ignored the locked room, dismissed the lack of defensive wounds, and refused to question the enslaved workers on the property. Williams filed his report on March 18th, 3 days after the body's discovery. The document, preserved in the archives of the county courthouse, runs to barely 2 pages. It describes Riverside as a man of good character and sound habits, notes his death occurred during the night while he slept, and attributes the cause to natural failure of the heart, consistent with his age and constitution. The report mentions no evidence of violence, no signs of intrusion, no suspects, and no need for further investigation. The brevity and incompleteness of the report become comprehensible only when understood in context. Porter Williams was not a fool, nor was he blind to evidence. He was a functionary operating within a system that prioritized stability over truth. Acknowledging that a plantation owner had been murdered in his own bedroom, in a locked room by someone who left no trace, would have created panic across the planter class. It would have suggested that the people they claimed to own might be capable of violence they could neither predict nor prevent. It would have destabilized the entire fiction of absolute control upon which the slave economy depended. So Williams chose the path of willful ignorance. He wrote a report that contradicted physical evidence, filed it with appropriate bureaucratic formality, and moved on to other matters. When the overseer William Peters attempted to discuss the locked room and the missing slave, Williams cut him off with a warning that speculation about impossible circumstances served no useful purpose and might cause unnecessary alarm. Peters understood the message. Truth was less valuable than order, and order required silence. Jacob White, who should have been the primary suspect given his proximity to the house and his disappearance immediately following the death, was never interrogated because he could not be located. A cursory search of the plantation grounds revealed nothing. Williams sent notice to neighboring plantations describing an escaped albino slave, but the notice carried no urgency, no suggestion that the fugitive might be dangerous. Within days, the notice was forgotten among the dozens of similar announcements about runaways that circulated constantly through Alabama's plantation districts. The only person who seemed troubled by the inadequacy of the investigation was Dr. Harrison Mills, who had examined Riverside's body. Mills kept private notes documenting the crushed windpipe, the locked room, the absence of defensive wounds. He wrote in his journal, "I have examined hundreds of bodies in my career. Natural death does not leave bruises in the shape of fingers around a man's throat." What happened in that room defies explanation, but it was not natural causes. Someone killed Thomas Riverside, and that someone had hands strong enough to crush a windpipe and patient enough to wait until their victim was too deeply asleep to resist. The pattern emerges, 500 words. Between April and October of 1851, 3 more plantation owners died in their beds with crushed windpipes and locked doors. Walter Cunningham in Lowndes County, Francis Whitmore in Autauga County, Benjamin Calhoun in Dallas County. Each death was initially attributed to natural causes or unexplained accidents. Each property had recently acquired an albino slave for a negligible sum. Each man had died alone in a locked bedroom with no signs of forced entry. The local newspapers, uncomfortable with the implications, reported the deaths in separate brief notices that avoided drawing connections. The Wetumpka Spectator ran a 2-sentence announcement about Walter Cunningham's passing, noting he was survived by a wife and 3 children and would be remembered for his contributions to agricultural improvement. The Montgomery Advertiser gave Francis Whitmore 3 paragraphs, describing his death as sudden but peaceful, occurring during sleep in his 62nd year. Benjamin Calhoun's death merited only a classified notice in the Selma Dispatch, positioned between advertisements for patent medicines and auction announcements. But among the planter families, private conversations grew increasingly panicked. The deaths had occurred across 4 counties, separated by enough distance that official connections seemed unlikely. But the details were too similar to dismiss as coincidence. Women began insisting their husbands sleep with loaded rifles beside their beds. Overseers were ordered to maintain night patrols around the main houses. Several families installed additional locks on bedroom doors, as if multiplying barriers might somehow prevent whatever was happening. The most disturbing aspect was not the deaths themselves, but the impossibility of their circumstances. How does a man die of strangulation in a room locked from the inside? How does a killer enter and exit without leaving traces? How does someone move through a household without being seen or heard by anyone? The questions had no satisfactory answers, and the absence of answers bred theories that ranged from supernatural explanation to elaborate conspiracy. Some whispered about curses, about albino slaves carrying afflictions that could kill from a distance. Others proposed more practical theories: hidden passages in old houses, accomplices among household servants, poisons that mimicked strangulation. A few suggested the deaths might not be murders at all, that some disease was causing windpipe failures that resembled violence. But none of these explanations accounted for the pattern: the recent purchase of albino slaves, their disappearance following each death, the locked rooms, the complete absence of physical evidence. By November, several plantation owners who had recently acquired albino slaves sold them immediately, accepting financial losses to remove what they now understood might be existential threats within their properties. The auctions were conducted quietly, without public announcement, the sellers unwilling to explain why they were disposing of recently purchased labor at a fraction of acquisition cost. The buyers, when buyers could be found, purchased without asking questions, seeing only bargain prices without recognizing the danger those prices represented. Jacob White moved between properties like a ghost, purchased by men who saw only an opportunity for cheap labor, leaving behind bodies and questions that no investigation could answer. The pattern was established. The terror had begun. And 17 plantation owners whose names existed on a list that lived only in Jacob's memory were sleeping a little less soundly with each passing month. The theory of the locked room, 500 words. How does a man die of strangulation in a room locked from the inside with no evidence of another person's presence? This question consumed the planters, who finally acknowledged they faced a pattern rather than coincidences. Some proposed supernatural explanations: that the albino slaves carried curses, that their unnatural appearance marked them as vessels for demonic possession. Others suggested more practical theories: hidden passages in old plantation houses, spare keys obtained through theft, accomplices among the household slaves. The supernatural theories found surprising traction among people who would have dismissed such thinking as primitive superstition in other contexts. Reverend Thomas Ashford, who ministered to several of the affected families, delivered a sermon in October 1851, suggesting that albinism represented a mark of Cain, that those born without color carried divine punishment that manifested in their ability to bring death to the righteous. The sermon was well attended and earnestly discussed, evidence of how thoroughly the impossible circumstances had destabilized rational thought among people desperate for any explanation. The practical theories were equally unsatisfying upon examination. Hidden passages might explain entry and exit, but plantation houses were not medieval castles with secret corridors. They were wood-frame structures built in the previous 50 years, their architecture simple and straightforward. Investigators examined the homes where deaths had occurred, searching for concealed doors or passages. They found nothing. The houses were ordinary, their rooms accessible only through visible entrances that showed no signs of tampering. The theory of stolen keys suggested that Jacob had obtained copies of the locks securing bedroom doors. But this explanation failed to account for the fact that several victims had bolted their doors from the inside, using mechanisms that could not be unlocked with keys. Thomas Riverside's door, for instance, was secured with a bolt that slid into iron brackets mounted on the interior doorframe. The bolt could only be engaged or disengaged from inside the room, and it was found still secured when the overseer forced the door open the morning after Riverside's death. The accomplice theory proposed that household servants were collaborating with Jacob, that they unlocked doors or provided access in exchange for promises of freedom or revenge against cruel masters. This explanation was politically convenient. It suggested the solution was tightening control over all enslaved people, rather than acknowledging that one individual had found a method of killing that investigators could not comprehend. Several plantation owners responded by instituting harsh new restrictions, interrogating their household workers, and increasing surveillance of the quarters. The measures produced no useful information and only deepened the climate of fear. What none of the theories could explain was the complete absence of physical evidence. No footprints, no disturbed dust, no trace of anyone having been in the rooms except the victims themselves. It was as if the killer could pass through walls, or as if he had been in the room all along, waiting in a space that eyes trained to see only certain patterns simply could not perceive. The truth, when it finally began to emerge through testimony years later, would prove more disturbing than any supernatural explanation. That Jacob had learned to exploit the fundamental weakness in a system built on assumptions about visibility, that he had made himself functionally invisible by understanding how people see what they expect to see and overlook everything else. The Diary of Margaret Whitmore, so 500 words. In the archives of the Alabama Department of History, there exists a diary kept by Margaret Whitmore, widow of Francis Whitmore, one of the murdered planters. Her entries from October 1851 reveal a woman trying to make sense of her husband's death while grappling with thoughts that challenged everything she had been taught to believe about the people her family claimed to own. The diary is a small leather-bound volume, its pages yellowed and brittle, kept in a climate-controlled vault, alongside hundreds of similar documents from the antebellum period. Margaret began keeping the diary in 1849, recording the mundane details of plantation life, weather observations, social engagements, household accounts. The entries are written in careful script, the penmanship reflecting education typical of wealthy Southern women of her generation. But following her husband's death in June 1851, the tone shifts dramatically. The entry dated June 8, 1851, 2 days after Francis Whitmore's body was discovered, reads, Francis purchased that pale creature for $2, laughing about the bargain he had made. He said the slave's appearance would frighten the others into better behavior, that sometimes fear was a more effective management tool than reward. 3 weeks later, Francis was dead, and the pale one had vanished. The sheriff says my husband's heart failed, but I saw the marks on his throat. I saw his eyes, frozen in an expression of terror that natural death does not produce. Subsequent entries become increasingly introspective. On June 15th, she wrote, "I find myself unable to mourn Francis in the manner expected of a proper widow. We were married 23 years, but I am not certain I ever knew him as anything other than a role he performed. He was kind to me in public and indifferent in private. He spoke of enslaved people as property with the same tone he used to discuss livestock. I told myself this was normal, that all husbands of our class behaved similarly, but now I wonder if normalcy is merely cruelty we have agreed not to question." The entry that most troubled historians who later discovered the diary was written on July the 2nd, 1851. "I have been thinking about the pale one, whose name I never learned. Francis called him the ghost when speaking to other planters, as if denying his humanity made the purchase less embarrassing. I think now that Francis was correct to call him a ghost, but not in the way he intended. The enslaved people we claim to own are ghosts, present but unseen, working beside us but invisible to our moral consideration, suffering in ways we have trained ourselves not to perceive. And what happens when a ghost decides to become visible? What happens when something we have rendered invisible reaches out with solid hands and demands recognition? Francis died with those hands around his throat, and I cannot bring myself to call it murder. Murder suggests unlawful killing. But what law governs a system built entirely on violence? What justice exists in a world where some people own others? Francis died, and perhaps it was payment on a debt our family has been accumulating for generations. The diary ends abruptly in August 1851, the final pages torn out, leaving only the ragged edges of removed paper. The hunt that found only shadows at Swam 500 words. By November 1851, plantation owners across central Alabama had pooled resources to hire professional slave catchers, men experienced in tracking runaways through swamp and forest. They were given a simple description: an albino male, late teens, possibly traveling alone or possibly moving between properties using forged papers. The search lasted 3 months and produced nothing. The slave catchers hired for the hunt were among the most experienced in the region. Daniel Hutchins had recovered over 300 runaways during his career, using bloodhounds bred specifically for tracking human scent. James Crawford specialized in infiltrating enslaved communities, posing as a sympathetic freeman to gather intelligence about escape networks. Robert Kearns was known for his willingness to pursue fugitives across state lines, following trails that other catchers abandoned as too cold or too dangerous. Together they represented the most sophisticated manhunting operation the Alabama planter class could assemble. The hunt began in early November with systematic searches of the properties where deaths had occurred. The catchers examined the rooms where victims had died, looking for traces that official investigations had missed. They found nothing useful. No hidden passages, no evidence of forced entry, no physical traces that would indicate how the killer had entered and exited locked rooms. They questioned enslaved workers using methods that ranged from false promises to outright torture. The workers either knew nothing or refused to speak, and no amount of pressure produced information that advanced the investigation. Next, the catchers attempted to track Jacob's movements between properties. They knew he had been purchased by Thomas Riverside in January 1851 and had vanished following Riverside's death in March. They knew he had subsequently appeared on properties owned by Walter Cunningham, Francis Whitmore, and Benjamin Calhoun. though the mechanism of his movement between widely separated plantations remained mysterious. The catchers rode between these locations, examining roads and river landings, questioning merchants and ferry operators, searching for anyone who had seen a pale young man traveling alone. Several catchers reported sightings, but each time they closed in on their target, they found only abandoned camps, cold fire pits, evidence of recent presence but no actual person. Daniel Hutchins tracked what he believed to be Jacob's trail to a riverbank at dusk, his bloodhounds baying with certainty that their quarry was close. Hutchins reported that he saw a figure standing at the water's edge, pale in the failing light. He raised his rifle to shoot but found himself unable to distinguish the figure from the mist rising off the water. In the moment of hesitation, the figure vanished completely, and the bloodhounds lost the scent as if it had been erased. By February 1852, the organized hunt was abandoned. The planters who had funded the operation were unwilling to continue paying for results that never materialized. The slave catchers, accustomed to success and proud of their professional reputations, found themselves unable to explain their failure. Daniel Hutchins, in a letter to one of his clients, wrote, "This one is different. He moves like smoke, leaves no trail worth following, and seems to know we are coming before we arrive. I have tracked men through swamps and mountains, but I have never encountered anyone who could simply disappear like morning fog when the sun rises." The economics of terror. 500 words. The murders had consequences that extended beyond the immediate families of the victims. Property values declined in counties where deaths had occurred. Insurance companies, just beginning to offer policies covering enslaved labor, quietly stopped selling new policies in Alabama. Planters found themselves unable to secure loans using their human property as collateral, because banks recognized that the entire system rested on assumptions of control that were demonstrably false. The decline in property values was gradual, but measurable. Land that had sold for $30 per acre in 1850 was fetching $22 per acre by 1852 in counties where multiple deaths had occurred. The reduction reflected not just fear of the mysterious killer, but a broader crisis of confidence in the slave system itself. If enslaved people could kill their masters with impunity, if someone purchased for 3 cents could destroy someone worth thousands, then the entire economic logic of slavery was revealed as fiction. Insurance companies that had begun offering policies covering enslaved labor as property against loss through death or escape responded to the Alabama murders by withdrawing entirely from the market. The policies had been experimental, an attempt to provide planters with financial protection against losses that could devastate estates. But the locked room murders created actuarial problems the companies could not solve. How do you calculate risk when the threat cannot be quantified? How do you price a policy protecting against something that appears impossible? The insurance companies chose not to try, canceling existing policies and refusing to issue new ones across Alabama and neighboring states. The banking crisis was perhaps most consequential. Plantation ownership required access to credit for purchasing land, buying enslaved workers, investing in equipment, covering expenses between harvests. Banks had traditionally accepted enslaved people as collateral for loans, valuing them as liquid assets that could be seized and sold if borrowers defaulted. But beginning in 1852, Alabama banks began refusing loans secured primarily by enslaved labor. The reason, stated explicitly in several banks' internal memoranda, was that the recent murders had demonstrated that enslaved people represented unstable assets whose value could not be guaranteed. One bank president, writing to his board of directors in March 1852, explained, "We have traditionally valued enslaved labor at $800 to $1,200 per individual, depending on age, health, and skill. But this valuation assumes that the property remains controlled by its owner and continues to produce value through its labor. The recent incidents suggest that this assumption may be invalid. If enslaved people can kill their owners and escape without consequence, then they are not property in any meaningful sense. They are captive people whose captivity is maintained only through violence and the threat of violence. When that violence proves insufficient to prevent resistance, the entire system of valuation collapses. The economic effects rippled outward. Planters unable to secure credit reduced their operations, purchasing fewer enslaved workers and planting fewer acres. Slave traders reported declining sales throughout Alabama. The market for albino slaves, already minimal, disappeared entirely. No one would purchase them at any price. The terror was not just that masters were being killed. It was that the killing revealed slavery as a system maintained through illusions of control that could shatter the moment someone decided the consequences of resistance were preferable to the guarantees of continued submission. The testimony of Samuel Fletcher, 500 words. In 1853, nearly 2 years after the killings began, an enslaved man named Samuel Fletcher was arrested in connection with an unrelated escape attempt. During his interrogation, likely under torture, he provided information about Jacob White that investigators had been unable to obtain through any other means. Fletcher claimed he had worked alongside Jacob at the Garrison Plantation in 1848, that they had shared quarters and late-night conversations. The interrogation took place in the basement of the Montgomery County Courthouse, a stone room with iron rings set into the walls for securing prisoners during questioning. Sheriff Porter Williams conducted the interrogation personally, assisted by 2 deputies and a court clerk who documented Fletcher's statements. The transcript of the interrogation survives in the county archives, 18 pages of questions and answers recorded in the clerk's careful handwriting, with marginal notes indicating when physical coercion was applied to encourage cooperation. Fletcher was 34 years old at the time of his arrest, literate despite laws prohibiting enslaved people from learning to read, and known among the enslaved community as someone who maintained connections across multiple plantations. He had been arrested while attempting to escape to the north using forged freedom papers, caught at a checkpoint south of the Tennessee border. The forged papers suggested he had assistance from someone skilled in document creation, and the sheriff hoped Fletcher might provide information about an escape network operating in the region. According to the transcript, Fletcher initially refused to answer questions about other enslaved people, maintaining silence despite escalating violence. But when Sheriff Williams mentioned Jacob White and the locked room murders, Fletcher's resistance collapsed. He said, "You want to know about the pale one? You want to know how he does what he does? I will tell you because knowing will not help you catch him." Fletcher's testimony, delivered in broken sentences between applications of physical coercion, described Jacob's philosophy of invisibility. He said Jacob had spoken often about learning to become invisible, not through magic but through understanding how white people saw, or failed to see, those they enslaved. He said they only see what they expect, Fletcher testified. They expect a slave to look a certain way, to move a certain way, to be where they're supposed to be. He said if you looked wrong enough, moved quiet enough, stood still enough, you could be in a room and they wouldn't know you were there. You could be everywhere and nowhere. According to Fletcher, Jacob had practiced stillness for hours, standing motionless in corners or against walls, timing how long it took for people to forget he was present. He had studied the architecture of plantation houses, learning which floors creaked and which doors squeaked. He had memorized the schedules of everyone in every household where he worked, knowing when masters slept and when they were most vulnerable. He wasn't supernatural, Fletcher said. He was just patient, and he understood that people see what they expect to see, nothing more. The testimony was never used in any prosecution. Fletcher died in custody 3 days after the interrogation, officially from injuries sustained during his capture. Though witnesses suggested his death followed too closely his cooperation with authorities. The 14th victim and the message left behind. 500 words. In March of 1853, plantation owner Harrison Caldwell was found dead in circumstances identical to the previous victims. Crushed windpipe, locked room, no evidence of intrusion. But this killing included a new element that transformed the investigation. Written in ash on the floor beside the bed was a message in careful letters: 17 more. The handwriting was educated, precise, suggesting someone who had not only learned to read and write, but had practiced extensively. Harrison Caldwell had owned a large plantation in Autauga County, operating with over 60 enslaved workers, and a reputation for systematic cruelty that made him feared even among other planters. He had purchased an albino slave in February 1853, paying 50 cents at a private sale arranged through an intermediary who refused to identify the seller. Caldwell announced to his overseer that he intended to prove albino slaves could be made productive through proper discipline, that previous owners had simply been too lenient in their management methods. The discipline Caldwell applied consisted of 18-hour workdays in the cotton fields, minimal food, and beatings for any perceived infraction. He assigned the albino slave to sleep in a tool shed adjacent to the main house, within easy reach for nighttime inspections that Caldwell conducted irregularly to ensure his property remained properly subordinated. The arrangement lasted 3 weeks. On March 23rd, Caldwell's body was discovered by his wife when he failed to wake at his usual early hour. The message written in ash beside the bed changed everything about the investigation. Previously, authorities could maintain the fiction that the deaths were either natural or the result of random violence. But 17 more indicated premeditation, planning, and a specific list of targets. Investigators understood immediately that 17 plantation owners remained on a list, chosen for reasons unknown, marked for execution. Sheriff Williams, who had dismissed previous deaths as coincidental or unexplainable, now faced evidence he could not ignore. He called for assistance from state authorities, requested military support, and sent urgent notices to every plantation owner in central Alabama, warning them of the threat. The message created panic that previous deaths had not generated. Planters demanded protection. Some abandoned their properties temporarily, relocating to cities where they believed safety could be found in numbers and proximity to law enforcement. The precision of the handwriting disturbed investigators as much as the message itself. Someone enslaved, officially prohibited from literacy, had not only learned to write but wrote with a clarity that suggested extensive education. The letters were formed with care, each character perfectly legible, the spacing between words exact. This was not writing learned hastily or practiced in secret. This was the hand of someone who had studied writing as a skill to be mastered and deployed strategically. Most troubling was the implication that the killings would continue until 17 more victims had been claimed. The number was specific, deliberate, calculated. This was not random violence born of opportunity. This was systematic revenge, each death a payment on a debt whose full accounting existed in only one person's mind. And that person, despite the best efforts of professional slave catchers and local law enforcement, remained invisible, untouchable, moving through Alabama's plantation country like death itself had learned to walk upright. The Failed Trap, 500 words. In April of 1853, 3 plantation owners who believed themselves likely targets collaborated on an elaborate trap. They would announce that one of them, Marcus Henley, had acquired an albino slave. They would spread word of the purchase through networks of enslaved workers, knowing that information traveled between plantations, despite all attempts to prevent communication. Then they would wait, with Henley's bedroom monitored by armed men hiding in adjacent rooms, doors that appeared locked but could be opened instantly, every precaution taken to catch the killer when he inevitably appeared. Marcus Henley owned a substantial plantation in Montgomery County, with property adjacent to estates belonging to Douglas Warren and Thomas Mitchell. The 3 men had been friends for decades, had served together in the state militia, and now found themselves united by fear that their names might be among the 17 targets promised in the message found beside Harrison Caldwell's body. They met in secret at Henley's property to develop their plan, bringing no enslaved workers who might overhear their conversation. The trap was designed with meticulous attention to detail. Henley would announce publicly at the Montgomery market that he had purchased an albino slave from a failing plantation in Mississippi. The announcement would be made loudly, within hearing of enslaved workers who accompanied their owners to market. The fictional slave would be kept in a locked storage building, supposedly for quarantine purposes, but actually remaining entirely imaginary. Henley would maintain his normal routine, retiring to his bedroom at 10 o'clock each night. But the bedroom would be under constant surveillance. Armed men would hide in the adjoining dressing room, with the connecting door left slightly ajar so they could observe Henley's bed and respond instantly to any disturbance. Additional guards would be stationed in the hallway outside the bedroom, positioned where they could not be seen from the bedroom door, but could respond within seconds to any alarm. The bedroom door would appear locked from the inside, but the lock mechanism had been altered so it could be opened from the outside, using a hidden lever known only to the conspirators. The trap was maintained for 2 weeks, from April 10th through April 24th, with guards rotating in shifts to maintain constant vigilance. Nothing happened. No attempt was made to enter Henley's bedroom. No unusual sounds were heard during the night. The guards grew tired and complacent, eventually questioning whether the entire exercise had been necessary. Then on April 26th, 2 days after the trap was abandoned, Douglas Warren was found dead in his bed 30 miles away in Dallas County. Crushed windpipe, locked room, no signs of intrusion. Beside his bed, written in ash, 16 more. The message was clear. The killer could not be deceived, could not be anticipated, operated, according to logic that investigators could not penetrate. He knew about the trap before it was sprung. He had identified it as deception and had simply bypassed it entirely, striking instead at a target the conspirators believed was protected by distance and vigilance. The failed trap achieved only one thing. It demonstrated that Jacob White possessed intelligence networks that matched or exceeded those available to the planter class, that he moved through their world with knowledge that should have been impossible for someone enslaved to obtain. The testimony of Rebecca, house slave, 500 words. Among the archives of testimony collected during the investigation, one statement stands out for its psychological insight. Rebecca, a woman enslaved at the Whitmore plantation, was questioned about the night Frances Whitmore died. She told investigators that she had served dinner that evening, that the master had seemed in good spirits, that nothing appeared unusual. But when pressed, she added something the investigators found disturbing. The interrogation took place in September 1853, more than 2 years after Frances Whitmore's death. Rebecca was 43 years old, had worked in the Whitmore household for over 20 years, and had a reputation among white families in the area as a reliable and obedient servant. The investigators questioning her believed she might provide insight into how Jacob White had entered and exited locked rooms without detection, assuming she had witnessed something she had not previously reported. Rebecca sat in a wooden chair in the Whitmore parlor, the same room where she had served tea to countless visitors over 2 decades. Sheriff Williams and 2 deputies stood over her, their postures designed to intimidate. Margaret Whitmore, the widow, sat in the corner observing, but not participating. The questioning began with routine inquiries about the events of the evening. Frances Whitmore died. What time dinner was served, what foods were prepared, whether the master had seemed ill or troubled. Rebecca answered each question with the careful precision of someone who understood that any inconsistency might be interpreted as guilt. Dinner had been served at 7 o'clock. The master had eaten heartily. Roasted pork, potatoes, greens from the kitchen garden. He had seemed pleased with the meal, had complimented the preparation. He had retired to his study after dinner, and then to his bedroom around 10 o'clock, his customary schedule. Nothing had seemed unusual. But when Sheriff Williams asked specifically about the albino slave who had been on the property, Rebecca's careful composure shifted slightly. She said, "I saw the pale one that afternoon. He was standing in the hallway upstairs when I came to turn down the beds. I knew he wasn't supposed to be in the house, but I didn't say nothing." The admission hung in the air. Williams leaned forward. "Why didn't you report his presence?" Rebecca met his gaze, directly for the first time. "You want to know why?" "Because I understood what he was. He was a ghost made flesh, proof that all our suffering had weight, had consequences." I looked at him, and he looked back at me, and I knew Master Whitmore would be dead before sunrise, and I said nothing. We all said nothing, because some debts require payment. The testimony ended there. Williams ordered Rebecca whipped for her failure to report what she had witnessed, but he did not pursue additional questioning. What could he ask? Whether other household workers had maintained similar silence, whether the entire enslaved population had collectively decided that the deaths of their masters served a justice that law refused to provide. These were questions whose answers would reveal truths the system could not accommodate. Rebecca's testimony was filed and forgotten, too dangerous to discuss openly, too disturbing to acknowledge in official records. The year of paranoia, 500 words over 1854, became known among Alabama's planter class as the year no one slept. Every unexplained noise triggered panic. Every shadow held potential threat. Plantation owners hired guards to stand watch through the night, installed multiple locks on bedroom doors. Some even constructed hidden sleeping chambers whose locations were known only to immediate family. But the precautions proved useless. The paranoia manifested in ways that transformed daily life across central Alabama. Planters who had previously slept soundly now woke at every sound, reaching for loaded weapons they kept beside their beds. Wives insisted on sleeping in rooms separate from their husbands, reasoning that if death came for their spouses, at least they would not be in the same room when it happened. Children were sent to live with relatives in other states, removed from plantations where the threat seemed most acute. The economic costs of the paranoia exceeded even those of the actual murders. Plantation owners spent fortunes on security measures that provided no actual security. They hired guards at wages that cut into profits, installed expensive lock mechanisms that could not prevent what they feared. Some constructed elaborate safe rooms within their homes, reinforced chambers with multiple locks and no windows, where they retreated each night with weapons and water sufficient to last until morning. The rooms became expensive coffins, trapping terrified men in darkness while they waited for dawn. The guards themselves proved unreliable. Men hired to maintain vigilance through the night fell asleep at their posts, exhausted by weeks of constant watchfulness. Others quit after a few weeks, unwilling to continue work that seemed both futile and cursed. Several guards reported seeing pale figures in darkness, shapes that vanished when approached, sounds of movement in empty rooms. Whether these reports reflected genuine encounters or imagination inflamed by fear remained unclear. But they contributed to a growing sense that normal precautions could not address an abnormal threat. The deaths continued throughout 1854 with methodical regularity. In February, plantation owner William Sutton died in Elmore County. Crushed windpipe, locked room, message in ash reading 15 more. In May, Charles Davidson died in Perry County under identical circumstances, the message reduced to 14 more. In August, Robert Hayes in Macon County, 13 more. In November, Samuel Morrison in Bibb County, 12 more. Each death followed the same pattern. Each message confirmed that a precise accounting was being maintained. By autumn of 1854, 17 plantation owners had died exactly as the original message had promised. And then abruptly, the killings stopped. No 18th victim was found. No 19th. The terror that had gripped central Alabama for nearly 4 years simply ended, leaving behind only questions and a population that would never again sleep quite so soundly in rooms with locked doors. The silence that followed was almost worse than the killings themselves. Planters waited for the next death, certain it would come, unable to relax into the possibility that the violence had ended. They maintained their expensive security measures, kept their guards employed, continued sleeping in reinforced rooms. But weeks passed, then months, and no new bodies were discovered. The Pale Killer had vanished as mysteriously as he had appeared, leaving behind a legacy of fear that would persist for generations. The final disappearance, 500 words. In November of 1854, a passenger on a steamboat traveling from Mobile to New Orleans reported a strange encounter. A young man with extraordinarily pale skin, dressed in clothes that suggested modest prosperity, had boarded at a small river landing. He carried a leather satchel and a walking stick, traveled alone, and spoke to no one during the journey. When the boat docked in New Orleans, the man disembarked and disappeared into the crowds of the port city. The passenger who reported this encounter was a merchant named Edward Thornhill, traveling to New Orleans to negotiate cotton contracts. Thornhill later testified that he had noticed the pale young man because of his unusual appearance and the confidence with which he moved. The man wore a dark wool suit of good quality but not expensive, the clothing of a tradesman or clerk rather than gentry. His hair was hidden beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but his pale hands and face were visible in the lamplight of the passenger cabin. Thornhill claimed he had attempted to engage the pale young man in conversation during the journey, which took 3 days traveling downriver from Mobile. He had asked where the man was traveling, what business he pursued, whether he had family in New Orleans. The man had initially responded with polite but minimal answers. He was traveling on personal business, he had no family waiting, he preferred not to discuss his affairs with strangers. But on the final evening of the journey, as the steamboat approached New Orleans and the lights of the port city became visible on the horizon, the pale young man had spoken more freely. Thornhill reported that they stood together at the rail, watching the city approach. Thornhill had commented that New Orleans offered opportunities for those willing to work hard and conduct themselves respectably. The pale man had smiled, Thornhill said, a smile that suggested secrets too heavy to share. "Where are you traveling?" Thornhill had asked directly. The pale man had turned to look at him, his colorless eyes reflecting lamplight like water. "Anywhere but here," he had replied. "Anywhere the dead cannot follow." Then he had turned back to watch the approaching city, and Thornhill had understood that further questions would not be welcomed. When the steamboat docked at New Orleans, Thornhill watched the pale man disembark with his leather satchel and walking stick. The man moved through the crowd on the dock with fluid ease, never hesitating, never looking back. Within moments, he had vanished into the narrow streets of the French Quarter, absorbed into a city where anonymity was possible and questions about origins were rarely asked. It was, many believed, the last confirmed sighting of Jacob White, though rumors of his presence would surface periodically in the decades that followed. Some claimed to have seen him in Philadelphia, working as a printer's assistant. Others reported encounters in Boston, New York, Chicago, always in cities, always in places where anonymity was possible, always just beyond reach of those who sought confirmation. Whether he lived to old age or died young, whether he found peace or carried his rage like a burden until his final breath, remains unknown. He simply vanished, leaving behind only bodies, questions, and a warning written in ash. The legacy. Written in blood and silence, 500 words. The story of Jacob White was never officially documented in the historical records of antebellum Alabama. The plantations affected by the killings attributed deaths to natural causes in public documents, unwilling to admit that someone they claimed as property had systematically executed their owners and escaped all consequences. But in the private letters and diaries of the period, in the whispered stories passed between generations, the truth persisted. The official records maintain a fiction that historians have only recently begun to challenge. Death certificates from the period list heart failure, natural causes, accidents, anything except murder by an enslaved person who defied every attempt at capture. Plantation ledgers make no mention of the albino slaves who passed through their properties in the months before owners died. County courthouse documents describe routine sales and transfers of property, the language deliberately vague about the nature of that property, and the circumstances surrounding its acquisition and disposal. But the private records tell a different story. In letters between plantation families, in diary entries never intended for public view, in testimony collected but never officially acknowledged, the truth appears in fragments. Margaret Whitmore's diary, hidden for decades before being discovered by historians. Samuel Fletcher's interrogation transcript, filed in a basement archive and forgotten. Rebecca's testimony, documented but never acted upon. These scattered pieces form a narrative that official history refused to record. The legacy of Jacob White extends beyond the 17 bodies found in locked rooms. He demonstrated something the slave system was designed to deny, that control is an illusion, that vengeance does not require permission, and that the moment you reduce a human being to nothing, you create the conditions for everything to burn. He was purchased for almost nothing, a person deemed worthless by every metric the slave economy recognized. And from that position of absolute powerlessness, he had executed 17 men who believed themselves untouchable. The psychological impact on Alabama's planter class persisted long after the killing stopped. The locked room murders became a ghost story told in whispers, a warning about what happens when systems built on violence finally generate the violence they have always deserved. Parents told children to treat enslaved people with caution, not from mercy but from fear. The lesson was not that slavery was wrong, but that cruelty carried risks that might manifest in locked rooms during the darkest hours of night. Jacob White himself passed into legend, his story transformed through repetition until fact and fiction became indistinguishable. Some said he had returned to Africa, others that he had died in New Orleans, still others that he lived to old age in the North, working quietly under an assumed name and never speaking of what he had done. The truth remains unknown, buried with him in some unmarked grave whose location no one recorded. But the 17 bodies found in locked rooms remain documented fact, evidence that cannot be erased no matter how thoroughly official records attempt to deny their meaning. Some debts, no matter how thoroughly ignored, eventually demand payment. And payment, when it finally comes, arrives in forms that the powerful never anticipate and can never prevent.